Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. I'm your host, Joe, and as always, I'm joined by my old college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How are you, my old friend?
Thank you for asking, old friend. We are actually going through a really tough time with our dog. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but she's suffering a lot of anxiety. She's a Border Collie Australian Shepherd mix, which is super smart and trainable, and that's nice, but they also are kind of high-strung. And so she's been having anxiety attacks, which in dog form means she sees something outside the window or she hears something in the hallway and just freaks out about it. So we tried CBD oil with her, which is like marijuana with all the fun parts taken out, and that did not help. And so now we are going to try some other naturopathic stuff, and then if that doesn't work, the next thing is dog Prozac, which seems kind of extreme to me, so I'm looking forward to trying other things before we go down that road.
Wow, I'm really sorry to hear that. And, well, I have a Border Collie mix myself, but luckily she has not had any of these symptoms. Do you know what the trigger might have been?
We consulted with the trainer, and she said these things can just build sort of quietly in the background, that the dog is like low-level triggered in a way that you wouldn't notice as an owner. And it's only when it becomes a big problem that it is evident to you. And I've always wondered how dogs are dealing with the fact that everybody wears masks these days, because of course dogs are famous for focusing on human facial expressions and reading what they see there.
Yes.
And it may be that my dog is just having trouble with the fact that she doesn't have any faces she can look at.
Yes, and since you mentioned that, I have to tell this story about exactly this point, that I went to visit my sister recently, and she's got a few dogs, including a German Shepherd who I met as a puppy and spent quite a lot of time with, but hadn't seen in several months, and now he's fully grown. When I got out of the cab at my sister's house, fully masked with sunglasses on, this big German Shepherd actually ran at me and attacked me and bit me, even though he knew me well. And after we recovered from the shock of this, I said, how the heck could that happen? Didn't he smell me or recognize me? And they said, you know what? You were wearing a mask and sunglasses. My sister said she could barely recognize me. So I think there's a lot to that. The masking might be the trigger.
Yeah, dogs are amazing creatures. They are even better than chimpanzees at anticipating human behavior. Like, this is one of a topic that I just never tire of reading about, is the way that dogs and humans co-evolved.
Yeah.
Maybe a subject for a future podcast.
Oh, I was just thinking the same thing. And either one of us would gladly dig into that. But let's get to the topic of today's podcast, which is defund the police. Before I throw it to you, I just want to say a couple words about why I asked this question. So, like most of the country, we were riveted by the election results. And when it became obvious that Biden was going to defeat Trump, but that the Democrats were unlikely to retake the Senate, and in fact were going to lose a bunch of seats in the House, the usual circular firing squad of Democrats started chipping away at each other, moderates accusing progressives of undermining electoral prospects and vice versa. And one of the arguments that the moderates used was, well, we've been associated with socialism and unfairly tarred as defund the police, and that's why we lost this year. So, you and I actually discussed the socialism aspect of this in our last episode about the Latino Hispanic vote. But the defund the police part kind of stuck with me. So I wanted to ask you, what the heck is defund the police? Where did it come from? And what might an actual movement to defund police in America look like? So what did you find?
Well, what I found is that defund the police is clearly a powerful and provocative slogan and hashtag, and that there's also a bit of a problem with the fact that sometimes it seems like it is mostly a hashtag. There's not a lot of agreement within the movement of what exactly defund the police would mean in practice. Some people are looking for outright abolishment, a society without any cops at all. Others are looking for reapportionment of some resources to other social support systems. But what there is not is some defund the police organization along the lines of the NAACP that has a mailing address and a communications director and a coherent set of principles and action plans. The slogan is new, but the idea is pretty old. People have been calling for the police to be dismantled for nearly 100 years at this point. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois argued in Black Reconstruction for the abolition of institutions that were rooted in racist and repressive factors, and among these he included prisons and police. In the 1960s, activists like Angela Davis called for the defunding or abolition of police departments, but the modern movement has coalesced around a book that was published in 2017 called The End of Policing by Alex S. Vitale. Generally speaking, calls for defunding the police have come from Black scholars and advocates and from their allies, and the reason is racism. It's often cited within their works that the first police forces in the South grew out of slave patrols that were charged with catching and returning runaway slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the thinking is that an institution that began with racism and a commitment to oppression cannot escape that legacy. And historically, there's a lot to support this view. Police actions frequently appear to be racially motivated. Particularly in the Jim Crow South, it's pretty much impossible to argue with a straight face that the police does not at least occasionally operate as an intrinsically racist institution. Even today, according to the Pew Research Center, the incarceration rate of Black Americans is more than 5 times as high as whites on a per capita basis, and nearly double the rate of Hispanic Americans. In 2019, 24% of people killed by police were Black, despite the fact that African Americans represent only 13% of the U.S. population. According to one statistic, Blacks represent 13% of all drug users, but 35% of those arrested for possession, 55% of those convicted, and 74% of those sent to prison. One very modern incarnation of this trend is the long list of unarmed Black men and women who were killed by police. This past summer, the Black Lives Matter protests were triggered by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and we saw how police departments across the country responded to those protests. They deployed tear gas against peaceful protesters. They were caught on video punching, shoving, pepper spraying, tasing, trampling, and even sometimes driving their vehicles into protesters. And I know it was striking for me personally that citizens were out in the streets protesting police brutality, and far too many cops were responding with even more brutality. And so the thinking goes, if police started out as a racist institution, and if historically it has operated as a racist institution, then it would be naive to think that police reform will change it into anything else. And in fact, Defund the Police supporters point out the many times and many ways in which reform has failed to produce an outcome. Sometimes the reform is in unintended consequences. For instance, over in the penal system, an attempt to reform the situation in which indeterminate sentencing meant that the same crime could lead to wildly different sentences led to sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums that had the effect of sending a whole lot of people to jail for relatively minor offenses. Other times, the reforms are dismantled after the fact, once the political situation changes. For instance, the Trump administration rolled back many of the guidelines that the Obama administration had put in place in order to hold police more accountable for their actions. And other times, the reforms are simply ignored. Here in Seattle, during the summer protests, the city council voted unanimously to ban the use of tear gas against protesters. And as a response, our local police union simply issued a statement that cops would disregard the new ordinance until it was included in their next collective bargaining settlement. Police unions, in fact, are often implacably opposed to reform and routinely shield their members from discipline or firing, even if they've blatantly broken the rules or the law.
Yeah, well, the New York City police unions endorsed Donald Trump this year, which tells you something about how they do not represent New Yorkers writ large if they would endorse such an unpopular figure in our city. So,
yes,
not surprising to hear about their implacable opposition to anything smacking of reform.
Yes, it's a similar situation here in Seattle, and I imagine in a number of other communities. Prosecutors are also notoriously reluctant to prosecute cops, since they need police cooperation. To succeed in his job, a prosecutor needs police to furnish him with evidence and deliver useful testimony under oath. That's already a conflict of interest, but some prosecutors say they've been warned by local police that if they bring a case against a cop, other officers would retaliate by refusing to cooperate in future cases. Grand juries are pretty notorious for not indicting police officers who use excessive force or even kill unarmed civilians. And though grand jury proceedings are kept secret, it's not hard to imagine why indictments might be rare if even the prosecuting attorneys are motivated to shield police officers from indictment. So it's very hard to bring a criminal case against a police officer. Meanwhile, qualified immunity shields cops from civil liability as well. The topic of qualified immunity could fill an entire podcast episode, but the gist of it is, since 1987, the courts have shielded public officials from civil suits, even when they knowingly and deliberately break the law, unless there's a legal precedent that involves the same specific context and the same specific conduct. For example, a prison guard pepper sprayed an inmate in his cell for no reason at all. He was just having a bad day, I guess. But the court ruled that he had qualified immunity because, although there was legal precedent that it was unconstitutional to beat or tase prisoners in their cells, there was no ruling that specifically prohibited the use of pepper spray. Qualified immunity has also protected a police officer who accidentally killed a 10-year-old child while shooting at the kid's dog. It protected officers who stole more than $200,000 while executing a search warrant. And it protected an officer who picked up a mentally impaired man, drove him across the county line, and dropped him off on the side of the highway, where he was later struck and killed by a motorist.
Yeah, now I don't know if what I'm about to say is qualified immunity per se, but another thing that kind of rankles me is the excuse that cops use when they are put on trial or administrative proceedings, that they felt they were in imminent danger of losing their lives. That seems to be the magic word, the get out of jail free card whenever you're on trial for shooting or killing somebody unjustifiably.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's qualified immunity, but it sounds similar to what you're describing.
Yeah, I think that would apply in criminal cases. So it's not qualified immunity, which applies to civil cases. But it has been a defense that's been offered even in cases where cops shot at children who were holding toy guns.
Tamir Rice.
Yes, you're right. It's very frequently offered as a defense, and cops are very rarely convicted, even when they're brought on trial. So even in the very unlikely case that qualified immunity does not shield an officer from liability, the award against him is likely to be paid by his employer, the city or the county. In short, if a police officer violates your rights, it's unlikely that charges will be brought against him. It's extremely unlikely that you'll be able to sue him for damages and win. And even if you manage to do that, the officer might not face serious consequences. That's why police reform can have frustratingly little impact, and why bad cops stay on the job for so long. Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd, had been on the force in Minneapolis for 20 years, during which he'd been the subject of 17 separate misconduct complaints. Those 17 complaints resulted in 2 letters of reprimand, but no other discipline, and it was not enough to get him removed from the force. He didn't face serious consequences until he kneeled on a man's neck for 9 minutes while angry citizens filmed him doing it. So reformers are basically saying, forget about police reform. Reform is a lie, a delaying tactic, a convenient fiction. It doesn't work and it can't work because you're asking a racist leopard to change its spots. Instead of reform, they say, we need to get out of the police business altogether. They are arguing that we should take the money that's being spent on policing and spend it on something else that might have a chance at solving the underlying problems. And we do spend a lot of money on police. U.S. cities collectively are spending about $115 billion per year on policing, and this is often the largest or second largest single expenditure.
Yes.
The LAPD budget represented about 18% of LA's budget in 2020 and 54% of the city's general funds, which is to say tax revenues that are not designated for special purposes. In Chicago, Oakland, and Minneapolis, the police budgets account for 40% or more of general funds. And that's not even counting what we spend on prisons, which is a lot. In 2019, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we spent more than $80 billion keeping 2.3 million people behind bars, which works out to about $35,000 per prisoner every single year.
And, on that point, the New York City police budget alone is nearly $6 billion a year. And then when reform advocates wanted to take $1 billion out of that $6 billion budget, over 4 years, mind you, it met with vehement criticism from the police union and many others. And I believe they did manage to reallocate that money to other agencies. But the fact that it's a $6 billion budget is kind of mind-boggling to me, with so many other crises and priorities.
Right. And police budgets are generally considered to be bulletproof. It's very hard to build a political consensus around the idea of reducing those budgets.
Right, and that's because everybody wants to be policed. Understandably, everybody wants to be safe, but we want to be policed well. And just simply throwing money at the problem is not the same thing as getting policing right, doing it correctly, doing it legally.
Right. Yeah. So the Defund the Police movement actually has a lot in common with the prison abolition movement, which I didn't really know existed until I started researching this topic. Both are based on the conviction that our police and penal system are very expensive methods of solving a problem that they themselves create. The prison abolition movement argues that when you incarcerate someone and hold him without education, job training, or any effective means of rehabilitation, you are creating a career criminal. He went in as someone who made a mistake. He comes out with a felony record and very few opportunities to escape poverty except through more crime, which sooner or later will send him right back into the system. So it's a never-ending cycle that literally destroys lives. The prison abolition movement acknowledges that we're not just going to shut down all of our prisons the day after tomorrow. It's a process that starts with a commitment not to build new prisons and gradually whittle away at the system, replacing prison time with other sentences and methods of actual rehabilitation. One prominent idea is called restorative justice. This is a system by which, when a crime occurs, you bring the criminal, the victim, and other members of the community together, either face-to-face or virtually, to discuss the impact of the crime and agree on what restitution would look like. So instead of sending a criminal to prison, you hold them accountable for making restitution. There's an idea that prison abolitionists share with police abolitionists that violence is a communicable disease. When the state exerts violence by giving police guns and sending them out to confront criminals, or sometimes people who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time, it serves to perpetuate a cycle of violence that will only stop when the entire system becomes nonviolent.
Yes, and ditto the death penalty. Same argument applies.
Yeah, there's a poorly examined assumption in this country that the proper response to crime is punishment rather than rehabilitation, and that severe punishment deters the crime, and not a whole lot of effort to follow up to see if deterrence is actually a factor. So, as with prison abolitionists, the majority of Defund the Police advocates acknowledge that you can't just take cops off the street without replacing them in some way. In fact, history is pretty clear on this point. If all you do is cut the police budget without addressing crime and violence in some way, crime does go up. In 2010, for instance, a budget cut resulted in a 14% reduction in the number of officers in England and Wales, and that had the effect of a 20% increase in violent crime. So the thinking behind abolition is, look first at what police are called on to do. 9 out of 10 police calls have to do with nonviolent situations. These are things like traffic citations, evictions, homelessness, drug abuse, mental illness, and so on. When a cop with a gun shows up on these scenes, the potential for violence actually increases. 10 to 20% of officer time is spent responding to or transporting people with mental illness, while 1 in 4 adults killed by cops suffered from severe mental illness. So it does raise the question of whether these cases could have been handled by mental health professionals instead of involving the police at all.
Yes, point well taken on that. I'm still, though, stuck on the semantics here. You started that whole section by saying people in favor of abolition suggest that, and then you went on to discuss this perfectly sensible alternative to having police handle a particular type of call that they currently handle. But that's not abolition of the police. That's a reallocation of resources. So why the heck are we calling this defund the police or abolish the police? It's a misnomer, and it's getting, it arguably lost Democrats a lot of races this fall. So it's screwed up that we're calling that abolition. I mean, don't you agree?
I do agree that the words get in the way. What I would add to what you just said is that for everyone here, including the people who are talking about restorative justice and deploying mental health professionals, abolition is the ultimate goal. They want to get out of the police business. They want to reach a point at some point in the future when we don't have armed representatives of the government wandering down our streets. They see that as intrinsically making our society more violent. But what they are not communicating as effectively as they could is they're not talking about doing that tomorrow. They are talking that as an endpoint of a process.
Yes.
And in the meantime, you're taking things off the police's plate and handing it to other professionals who are better qualified.
Yes. Now that's a really interesting concept. But again, we want to get rid of pollution, right? But we don't call it abolish pollution because people would laugh at that. You can't abolish pollution. All you can do is do your bit to get rid of it and minimize it. And maybe over generations or hundreds of years, we can get pollution down to an acceptably low level, Maybe that's not a good example, but it just seems like an absurd phrase to abolish the police or defund the police.
Well, I think there's a tension here. There's a tension here between making effective policy on the one hand and motivating people to get out in the streets and demand change on the other. And the thing is, the phrases that work well as political motivators, as protest motivators, do not really encapsulate careful, well-reasoned policy decisions.
Yeah.
So, for instance, abolish pollution is the sort of thing that will get 20-somethings out in the streets to get their voice heard, which is an important part of the process because it motivates change, but it isn't a policy. And so I think in this case, what we have is a slogan that's effective in motivating people to protest against something that is a clear ill within our society.
Right.
But if you think that's all there is to it, then it just seems like a dangerously irresponsible idea.
Yeah. But even from a branding marketing perspective, it seems to me that if your real goal is to abolish the police, defund the police eventually, it's still kind of a stupid slogan because it's going to alienate so many people and scare the hell out of many other people. You should come up with some more accommodating, collegial way of referring to your agenda, even if it is a stealth campaign to ultimately defund the police.
Congressman Jim Clyburn compared defund the police to burn baby burn as a slogan from the 1960s that alienated people who might otherwise have supported racial justice initiatives. I'm flashing back to a Simpsons episode, and I'm going to hate myself because I know I'm going to get this quote wrong, where there was some demonstration and the leader shouted through a megaphone, "What do we want?" And the crowd answered, "Something better. When do we want it? At some point in the future," or something like that.
Right. It's not a sexy slogan, in other words.
It is
right?
not.
Yeah.
But we are probably better served as a community if the first responders to a nonviolent situation are not themselves heavily armed. And cops in America do kill a lot of people. In 2015, The Guardian noted that police officers in America killed more people in the first 24 days of that year than cops in England and Wales had in the previous 24 years. And some cities are putting programs like this in place, including the city where I grew up, Eugene, Oregon. My home city has a program in which medics and mental health counselors are dispatched in response to 911 calls that involve homeless people or others in distress. So, go Eugene. After this, it can get a little vague. As a rule, I found the defund movement to be somewhat short on specifics. It's more of a vision than a plan. Many of those who advocate for defunding the police have different ideas of how to go about it. Many advocate restorative justice, which we mentioned before. Some talk about canceling the war on drugs and transferring budget resources into addiction treatment centers. Some advocate for decriminalizing sex work. Others talk about the need for a generous welfare state, including affordable housing, healthcare, job training, and better schools. Others say that we should forget entirely about the top-down planning, just give impoverished communities money and let them figure out what to do with it. What unites all of these ideas is the conviction that confronting violence after it occurs does nothing to resolve the underlying issues that lead to violence, and it may in fact simply cause the violence to escalate. So the solution from this point of view is a patchwork of programs that, bit by bit, remove police from the equation and replace force and punishment with support and rehabilitation. And the gold standard for this approach is Camden, New Jersey. In 2012, Camden, which had a reputation as the most dangerous city in the U.S., disbanded its police department in an attempt to deal with widespread corruption. They created a new police department under county control, which allowed them to start from ground zero with new officers, a new department culture, and also free rein with the budget. The new department actually had more officers than before, though they were paid less, and the roles were reframed to be more community-oriented with a focus on de-escalating violence. One officer is quoted in the New York Times as saying, quote, "The old police mantra was make it home safely. Now we're being taught not only should we make it home safely, but so should the victim and the suspect," unquote. And over the next 7 years after the change, violent crime dropped 42%, and the overall crime rate dropped by 44% in Camden. So there is a clear example that real progress can be made by communities that follow through on some of these policies.
I want to say something about your earlier mention of hiring more police and doing sensitivity training. I've heard Joe Biden make what I would call this classic liberal argument for reform of the police department. And I believe he said he's not at all in favor of defunding the police. He thinks the police should get more money along the lines you described, sensitivity training, more community policing. That seems similar to me to the problem of how to reduce traffic congestion. For years and years, we had traffic engineers arguing that if we could only add lanes to the highway, we will reduce congestion and commuting time. When in fact, the statistics say it would increase both by giving drivers more reasons to use the highway instead of developing high-quality, low-cost public transportation options and disincentivizing the use of cars. So I'm thinking that police reform, the way Biden understands it, the way you were just describing, that involves increasing budgets, beefing up outreach, adding more community policing, in addition, not instead of, but in addition to the SWAT team you already have on hand and all your militarized equipment. To me, that's like adding more lanes to the highway. It's profoundly misguided as a way to address a problem whose root, I think, is the over-reliance on cops to solve all of society's problems, which they have no business or expertise in solving.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I would offer another example of that, which is education funding in this country, where the United States already pays more per capita for education than any other country in the world. And whenever there's a problem in educational outcomes, the solution that's presented to us is that we need to increase education funding. And I think there are many examples where if you pour more money into a system that doesn't work, all you're doing is replicating the parts of that system that don't work. And that sometimes radical change, like Camden went through, where they just started from scratch, is what you need to do in order to see actual outcomes.
It's amazing to me that Camden is not a national model, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised that we're too stupid to see the light when it presents itself.
Well, maybe this podcast will blow the roof off of that and drive a wave of awareness of Camden, New Jersey across the nation. So what the Defund the Police movement ultimately aims for is something that already exists in upper-income neighborhoods in this country. Prison abolitionist and educator Mariam Kaba is quoted as saying, quote, "People in Naperville are living abolition right now. The cops are not in their schools. They're not on every street corner," unquote. You walk down the street and you don't see any cops in those neighborhoods. Why? Because they're not needed. Defund the Police imagines that life being lived by all Americans, not just the wealthy few. And I think we can agree that's an attractive vision, but not everybody shares it. First, there are the police unions, which of course are adamantly opposed to any cut in police funding. Typically, they characterize such proposals as putting cop lives at risk. And then there are conservative, tough-on-crime politicians who have taken up Defund the Police as the latest sign that liberal politicians, if elected, would let crime run rampant in city streets.
Yes.
This is a pretty powerful rhetorical device because polls say that neither Democrats nor Republicans currently support the idea. According to one poll, less than 20% of Americans support a cut in funding for police. And even among Black Americans, 81% wanted police to spend the same amount of time or more in their neighborhoods. Some inner-city advocates opposed to funding the police, arguing that it's a fairy tale concocted by white academics who won't have to live through the consequences if their policy ideas fail.
And speaking of slogans from the 1960s, your mention of the conservative politicians reminds me of Trump's constant parroting of law and order, which of course was Richard Nixon's stock phrase during the 1968 presidential election with the country torn apart by the Vietnam War. But, in practice, law and order is much more about order than it is about law, given the obvious criminality of so many police actions over the years.
Yeah, it generally means law for you and order for me.
Yeah.
Law for people who don't look like me, and nice, profitable order for people who do look like me.
Right.
So this is where we are now, with advocates and their opponents pretty much talking past one another, each side quoting studies and statistics that are mutually contradictory, and cities like Minneapolis initially voting to disband their police and then completely scrapping the idea a few months later. There are at least partial defunding initiatives underway in New York City, like you said, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Austin, and Seattle, and other communities as well. Opponents to these efforts quote statistics that say the more police you have on the street, the lower the rate of violent crime is. And they argue that what we really need is more cops with better training. But if you're convinced that history and experience both demonstrate that police work is intrinsically, irreducibly racist, you will never be persuaded that reform and training will change that levered spots. And so the argument goes on, with neither side really listening to the other.
Yeah, and is this a training issue with cops? What does it take for somebody to want to be a cop? And the reason I ask that question is because I can't imagine working a job where I have to carry a gun every day and maybe use that gun on somebody and do the ultimate act, irreparable act of shooting my gun at somebody. I can't imagine doing that. And so many cops are ex-military. And so I wonder whether carrying a gun as a soldier desensitized them to the gravity of using a gun and maybe normalized what is really a totally abnormal situation of there being a citizen on the street with a gun confronting another citizen who may or may not have a gun. And so I wonder whether training is an adequate tool in our toolbox to address this question of violence, because the people who want to be cops may just have an inclination toward violence, toward using guns to solve problems that would not be repaired by any amount of training.
I would agree with you that it's naive to think that training alone is going to solve this problem. If you've got cops like Derek Chauvin who have been on the force 20 years and have 17 misconduct citations, that's not a problem with training. Minneapolis actually had a pretty good setup of sensitivity training and unconscious bias training and all the rest of it. He simply should not have been on the force. If I'm thinking about what a good application of the principle to defund the police would be, it would be things like, first off, you got to demilitarize the cops. Quit transferring military-level equipment to police departments. The war on drugs spawned many, many bad ideas, and this was one of the worst. Cops should not have grenade launchers. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but I cannot fathom a world in which city police would have grenade launchers, where you would imagine a scenario in which a police officer would use a grenade launcher. They should not have that sort of equipment. Second, I do think qualified immunity needs to be scrapped 100%. Few things since we've been doing this podcast have made me as angry as qualified immunity made me when I was reading up on it. It's been so badly abused in so many communities for such a long time that is just simply a bad law, and we need to end it as soon as possible. I do think there's going to be a role for cops with guns, considering how many guns there are in America already. I would like to see a reduced role for police from the one that they play today. I do think it's a good idea to dispatch social workers to deal with mental health issues and homelessness. I also think that cops should not routinely carry guns. Maybe leave them in a lockbox in the squad car. I don't know, but as long as they are responding to complaints about the guy in the next apartment being too loud playing on his guitar, they should not be showing up to those things with weapons. I do think that real reform is basically impossible with the role that police unions play right now, given that they seem to be adamantly opposed to reform and individual accountability. So I think that large cities may need at some point to go the Camden route and simply disband their police department as a prelude to reconstituting it. I don't think we can approach any of this in a drastic way. It should be a multi-year and maybe even a multi-decade plan that looks at homelessness, drug use, education, and job opportunities. And ultimately, this needs to link up with sentencing guidelines and our problems with incarceration, which makes it all like a hell of a lot of work, which is kind of daunting to think about, but I don't see anything else that has much of a chance of working.
Yeah. In this era where we need so much work on so many different items, it's enough to paralyze you to think that we have so much to do just on this issue, which is probably 47th on the list that Biden is tackling when he assumes power next month.
Right. So probably the best thing to do next is the low-hanging fruit. It seems pretty obvious that if someone is experiencing a mental health crisis, that mental health professionals should respond to that.
Yes.
So cities can put in place that sort of program where 911 doesn't automatically send a cop out on every call. And that seems like a simple and clear and effective step towards what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with just about every single one of your proposals. I do think it's imperative that we delegate certain police responsibilities to other organizations, whether they be social workers, domestic abuse hotlines, mental health, as we mentioned before, youth services, housing services, drug counseling. Conflict resolution specialists could do a lot to defuse tensions that end up with police violence. But the one thing I would add to your list is the one I was kind of hinting at, and that is we need do-gooders to be policemen. Remember when in the old days, in the 50s, you'd move into your new house in your suburb and the housewife next door would bring a cake over, knock on your door and present you with a cake for moving into the neighborhood. We need people like her to be police officers. I think that would go a long way toward solving this problem. I really do believe that.
Yeah, I do too. And I'm reminded of Camden with their training to de-escalate situations, like resolve things in a way where nobody gets hurt, not even the suspect, and bring more of that spirit. Like in Camden, actually, in this article I was reading, the officers were asked how many tickets they were writing, and that was not a good thing. Like they were being encouraged to write fewer tickets because they were dealing with a community of people who were struggling with poverty. And in that circumstance, $100 or $200 ticket can be life-changing. It can just rock these people to their financial roots. And so they were encouraged to be writing less tickets. And like a police approach that is focused on the good of the community rather than the confrontation with the opposing violence. I think that's really where we need to get to. And it's a complete change in terms of how the police think about themselves, because their current training tends to emphasize a warrior model where they're out, like you said, like soldiers on a battlefield. And that battlefield is someone's home neighborhood. You can't think of it as a battlefield if you're going to bring the sort of justice that this country actually really needs. You need to think of it as someone's home. And what is the proper spirit? What is the proper energy to bring to someone's home, like that lady coming next door with the cake to welcome you?
Right. And, aided and abetted by all these idiots in government, especially in Trump's government. Like I'm thinking of that remark made by the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, and I don't remember the exact remark, but he was describing the efforts to clear the streets so that Trump could get over across the Lafayette Park to do his little Bible photo op over the summer. Esper said something like, we need to clear the battle space, or, we brought out sufficient resources so we could establish the war space so that the president could get over there. I'm butchering his quote, but it was something as ridiculous as that. And, that kind of rhetoric needs to go by the wayside as well.
100%. So, have I changed your mind about defund the police?
No, but you've provided me with a lot of the nuances that I was missing. And I really like your proposals. I really think they're the way we need to go. And, before we end this, I want you to humor me for a minute, because as you were speaking, I was kind of writing down alternative phrases to defund the police. And because I'm still stuck on it being such an inelegant phrase to describe something that's a worthy goal of our society. So I was trying to come up with alternatives, and demilitarize the police, de-weaponize the police, delegitimize the police. None of these are sexy, That's the problem with them. And of course, there is a sexy phrase used in the 60s by the Black Panthers, fuck the police. That's sexy, but it's a little bit polarizing, I would say.
Yes,
yes. What I came up with, the best thing I got here, Mark, is re-envision policing. Short and sweet and to the point. And I think it implies a lot of the things that you were getting at in your presentation. We need to rethink the way we do policing. And it has all these implications that involve defunding in some places, de-weaponizing, demilitarizing, delegitimizing the inappropriate uses of policing. It's all there in that phrase, I think. What do you think? Re-envision policing.
I'm not in love with the word re-envision, I got to tell you, but
Okay.
I'm on board with the idea. And what it reminds me of is the old Apple slogan, think different. And what do you think about police different?
Well, the problem with that is I'm an inveterate English major, Mark, and when Think Different came out, I thought, well, it's really think differently.
Yeah,
So
I know.
Police differently. But yeah, I take your point, though. I like that. These are two contenders. Maybe we could have our listeners vote on this. Re-envision policing versus police different.
100%.
And other suggestions that they might have.
Yeah. And speaking of having our listeners vote on this, we now have a Facebook page, which is you can find on Facebook by searching for Mansplaining the Podcast, or just /mansplaining pod within Facebook. And I will post this as a poll sometime after this episode comes out.
Yes, and we should add that there's no better place for a podcast full of untruths and lies and distortions than Facebook.
Yes.
So it's the natural landing place.
Yeah,
right?
It attracts untruth like a magnet. Like I felt compelled to place the page there. Mark Zuckerberg has mysterious powers. So are you ready for your question for next week?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so there are serious issues facing this country, and I considered all of them. But, honestly, screw that. The next time we're recording, we're going to be a week out from Christmas. So I thought, let's do something on Christmas. And so my question for you is, why is Christmas such a big deal? Like, if you think about it in terms of the religious calendar, probably Easter was more important. Most of the elements of Christmas have been patched together from here and there. So why is it that Christmas is the one that we make movies about? Christmas is the one where we have carols and songs, and you cannot get away from them in stores following Thanksgiving. How is it that Christmas became such a big friggin' deal?
Wow, Mark, that's a great question. I love it. I can't wait to get into that. And I really like your thinking ahead to us doing a podcast close to Christmas. So I'll have a whiz-bang show for you in 2 weeks.
Okay, looking forward to it.
All right, well, that's it for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.